Marcus had never expected salvation to arrive tangled in his fishing nets at dawn, pale and otherworldly, breathing in rhythms that defied everything he knew about life on Earth. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when he felt the unusual weight in his lines, that strange resistance that spoke of something far beyond the familiar pull of grouper or snapper. His weathered hands worked the ropes with the muscle memory of 30 years at sea, but when the nets broke the surface, his heart stopped. There, wrapped in hemp and seaweed, was a figure no larger than a child, its skin luminescent like moonlight on water, its limbs too delicate, too graceful to belong to this world. Marcus stumbled backward in his small boat, the oars clattering against the hull, his breath catching in his throat as the being's chest rose and fell with labored effort. It was dying. He knew this the way he knew storms before they arrived, the way he sensed the turning of tides in his bones. Without thinking, without questioning the impossibility, before him, he cut away the nets with trembling hands, cradling the fragile creature against his chest. Its body was warm, impossibly light, and where his calloused fingers touched its skin, he felt something surge through him, a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was not chance, he understood in that sacred moment. This was a threshold between worlds, and he had been chosen to stand upon it. The journey back to shore felt like moving through a dream, every wave carrying him closer to a destiny he had never imagined in his lonely, quiet life. Marcus kept the being wrapped in his worn canvas jacket, shielding it from the rising sun and from any eyes that might be watching from the distant docks. His cabin stood isolated at the edge of the bay, weathered grey wood that had sheltered him through countless solitary seasons, and now it would become a sanctuary for something infinitely precious. He laid the unconscious visitor on his bed, the same bed where he had slept alone for more years than he cared to, and count. And as he stepped back to truly look at what he had found, wonder flooded his soul. The being's features were achingly beautiful, large eyes sealed beneath translucent lids, a face that seemed to hold both ancient wisdom and childlike innocence. Hands with 6 delicate fingers that occasionally twitched as if reaching for something lost. Marcus found himself whispering a prayer, the first genuine prayer he had offered in decades, asking God what this meant, why him, why now. The room seemed to hold its breath around them both, the morning light streaming through salt-stained windows, illuminating the impossible scene with golden reverence. He touched the being's forehead gently, and again, that inexplicable peace washed over him, along with something else, a flicker of images, not quite thoughts, not quite visions, but impressions of vast distances traveled and terrible danger fled. As the hours passed, Marcus kept vigil beside his miraculous guest, watching for signs of consciousness, watching for the rise and fall of that strange chest, terrified that this gift would slip away before he understood its purpose. The creature began to glow softly as afternoon approached, a gentle phosphorescence that pulsed in time with its breathing, filling the humble cabin with a light that felt alive and intelligent. Marcus reached out again, unable to resist the pull, and this time when his fingers made contact, the visions came stronger, clearer. He saw stars, countless stars in configurations he had never witnessed from Earth's surface. He saw worlds of impossible beauty, crystalline cities and vast oceans beneath crimson skies. And he saw pursuit, dark ships like mechanical predators hunting through the cosmic deep, weapons that tore through the fabric of space itself. The being had run, had fled across incomprehensible distances, and had fallen into Earth's embrace not by accident, but by desperate necessity. Marcus gasped as the connection broke, his heart pounding, his mind struggling to contain what he had witnessed. The loneliness that had defined his existence for so long suddenly felt insignificant, a small ache in the face of such vastness. He was no longer just a forgotten fisherman in a forgotten corner of the world. The being's eyes opened as twilight painted the cabin walls purple and gold, and Marcus found himself staring into depths that held entire galaxies, into an intelligence so profound and gentle that he felt his very soul recognized and known. No words passed between them, yet understanding flowed like water finding its level, like light pouring into darkness. The visitor was dying, its luminescence flickering like a candle in wind, and it needed something that existed here, in Earth's ancient waters, something hidden. In places humans feared to venture. Marcus nodded without hesitation, though he did not fully understand, though the rational part of his mind screamed that this was madness. But he had touched divinity in those glowing visions, had felt the hand of God in this mysterious arrival, and he knew with absolute certainty that his entire life, every lonely dawn, every empty evening, every prayer whispered into the indifferent sea, had been leading him to this moment. The alien reached up with one fragile hand and placed it over Marcus's weathered heart, and in that touch he felt purpose ignite within him like a flame that would never be extinguished. Whatever came next, whatever dangers or revelations awaited, he would not turn away. The universe had chosen him, and he would answer. Through the deepening night, the alien's touch opened doorways in Marcus's mind that he had never known existed, flooding him with images that felt like memories from someone else's lifetime, yet resonated with the deepest truth of his own soul. He saw the being's journey with crystalline clarity now, not just the desperate flight across star-scattered darkness, but the why behind it all. There were hunters among the cosmos, ancient and merciless, who believed that beings like his visitor were abominations, creatures who carried within themselves a spark of the divine that these hunters sought to extinguish wherever it appeared. They traveled between worlds with single-minded purpose, eradicating any life that bore the mark of what Marcus could only understand as grace, that inexplicable quality that separated mere existence from sacred consciousness. His guest had fled from a massacre that had consumed its entire world, the sole survivor of a civilization that had spent millennia contemplating the face of God through mathematics, light, and love. Marcus wept as he witnessed the destruction in the shared vision, great towers of living crystal shattering under weapons of pure hatred, gardens where prayers had been sung to the Creator burning in silent vacuum. The being trembled beneath his hand, its glow dimming further, and Marcus understood that it carried not just the memory of its people, but their final prayer, that somewhere in the vast creation, the seed of divine understanding would take root again. This fragile creature was a living testament, a refugee bearing witness that even in the darkest corners of the universe, God's light persisted. The alien pulled its hand away gently, and Marcus found himself gasping as if surfacing from deep water, his cabin suddenly feeling impossibly small to contain the magnitude of what he now carried in his heart. The being gestured weakly toward the window, toward the dark ocean beyond, and new images formed in Marcus's mind, not memories this time, but urgent necessity. Deep beneath the waves, in a trench that local fishermen had whispered about for generations with superstitious dread, there existed a substance that had been placed there long ago, before human civilization had even dreamed of writing or agriculture. Marcus saw it in the vision, a crystalline element that glowed within a fire, growing in formations along ancient stone where the ocean floor had been carved with symbols that predated any language he recognized. The alien needed this substance to survive, to heal the terrible damage its body had sustained in the crash landing, to restore the light that was even now flickering toward extinction. But the vision showed him more than just the what and where. It showed him the why this particular element existed on Earth at all. It had been seeded here intentionally, he understood with sudden overwhelming clarity, planted in the deep places by those who had walked among the stars when Earth was young, left as a gift for future generations and as a beacon to travelers who might one day need sanctuary. God's provision, Marcus realized with trembling awe, extended beyond humanity, beyond Earth itself, woven into the very fabric of creation across distances that defied comprehension. The ocean he had fished all his life was not merely water and salt, but a repository of divine foresight. Marcus rose on unsteady legs, his fisherman's hands clenching and unclenching as he processed what was being asked of him, what necessity demanded, despite every rational fear that screamed warnings in his mind. The trench the alien had shown him was forbidden territory, a place where currents ran strange and boats disappeared without explanation, where even the most experienced divers refused to venture. He had heard stories since childhood of men who had gone down into those depths chasing legends of treasure or curiosity, men who either never returned or came back changed, speaking in riddles about lights in the darkness and voices that sang without sound. But looking at the dying being on his bed, seeing the trust in those vast, gentle eyes, Marcus felt something shift in the foundations of his understanding. His entire life had been so small, so circumscribed by fear and routine, by the safe boundaries of what was known and accepted. He had lived as a man abandoned by love, by purpose, by hope, and had made peace with his loneliness by telling himself it was simply his portion in life. Yet here was God, speaking to him through the most impossible messenger imaginable, asking him to step beyond every limit he had ever accepted. The alien reached toward him again, and this time when they touched, Marcus felt not visions, but something deeper, a wordless assurance that he would not be alone in the depths, that the same divine hand that had guided this creature across light years would guide him through dark water. Faith, he understood, was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. He gathered his diving equipment as dawn approached once more, ancient gear that he had not used in years, checking seals and air tanks with hands that had steadied with newfound resolve. The alien watched him with those luminous eyes, its glow now barely perceptible, its breathing shallow and labored. Marcus knelt beside the bed one final time before leaving, placing his weathered palm against the smooth, cool forehead and whispered words that surprised him with their certainty. "I don't know why you came to me," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "or why God chose a broken-down fisherman for something this important. But I believe, maybe for the first time in my whole life, I really believe that nothing happens by accident in his creation. You carry something sacred. I can feel it in every fiber of my being. And if there's even a chance that saving you means saving that spark of divine light you carry, then I'll go into any depths, face any darkness." The being's hand rose weakly to cover his, and in that touch, Marcus felt a gratitude so profound it transcended species, language, or world of origin. It was the universal recognition of one soul seeing another, of consciousness acknowledging consciousness in the vast loneliness of existence. As he stood and gathered his equipment, slinging the heavy tanks over his shoulders and checking his waterproof lights, Marcus felt the weight of destiny settling over him like a mantle. The ocean waited beyond his door, ancient and mysterious, holding secrets that predated human memory, and somewhere in its darkest heart lay the key to keeping this miraculous light alive. The boat cut through pre-dawn waters with a whisper that seemed too loud in the sacred stillness, Marcus navigating by instinct toward coordinates that existed only in his mind's eye, implanted there by the alien's desperate communion. Every pull of the oars sent ripples across glass-smooth surface that reflected stars still clinging to darkness, and he found himself praying without words, his heart speaking directly to the Creator in a language older than speech itself. The forbidden trench lay ahead, marked by a peculiar stillness in the water where even the ever-present gulls refused to fly, and as his small vessel drifted into that boundary between the known and unknowable, Marcus felt the temperature drop, as if he were passing through an invisible curtain between worlds. His diving suit felt inadequate against the magnitude of what he was attempting, but he methodically went through the preparations anyway, checking regulators and weight belts with fingers that trembled only slightly now, steadied by a purpose that transcended his mortal fears. As he sat on the edge of the boat preparing to roll backward into the abyss, he looked up one final time at the stars and wondered how many of them sheltered worlds where creatures like his guest had lived and loved and worshipped the same God he served. The thought filled him with an overwhelming sense of unity, of belonging to something far grander than he had ever imagined in his small, lonely life. The descent into darkness was like being slowly erased from existence, light fleeing upward as Marcus sank deeper into cold that pressed against his suit and bones with ancient, patient weight. His flashlight beam cut through blackness that felt almost solid, revealing only a small sphere of visibility in an ocean of night. And for long minutes there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant haunting songs of whales calling to one another in the deep. Then the walls of the trench began to appear, sheer cliffs of stone that dropped away beyond the reach of his light, and Marcus felt vertigo seize him as he realized he was suspended above depths that no human had ever plumbed, darkness that pre-existed humanity's first awakening to consciousness. His heart hammered against his ribs, panic threatening to overwhelm the fragile courage that had brought him here. But in that moment of crisis, he felt something, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with his own body heat, a presence that was unmistakably the alien reaching across the distance between cabin and ocean to steady him with that inexplicable peace. The fear didn't vanish, but it became manageable, transformed from paralyzing terror into reverent awe, and Marcus understood that he was not alone in this darkness, had never been alone, not in all his years of imagined abandonment. God was here in the depths just as surely as in cathedral or starlight, present in every molecule of salt water, every atom of ancient stone. His light caught the first symbol carved into the trench wall, and Marcus gasped so suddenly he nearly lost his regulator, bubbles exploding upward as he steadied himself and swam closer to examine the impossible artifact. The markings were deliberate, precise, worked into stone with tool or technique beyond his comprehension, each line and curve flowing into the next with a grace that spoke of reverence in their creation. They glowed faintly with bioluminescence, as if the rock itself had been infused with living light. And as Marcus traced the patterns with his gloved hand, images flooded his mind with such intensity that he had to grip the stone to keep from floating away into disorientation. He saw the carvers, beings of pure radiance working in these depths millennia before human civilizations rose, singing as they worked. Their song a prayer of preparation for a future they would never witness, but trusted in with absolute faith. They had known, these ancient architects, of divine providence, that their gift would one day be needed, that some distant wanderer fleeing darkness would find sanctuary in these prepared depths. Marcus wept inside his mask, salt water mixing with salt water, overwhelmed by the staggering scope of God's planning, the intricate care woven through time and space to ensure that even the least of his creatures, whether human fisherman or alien refugee, would find provision in their desperate hour. The symbols told a story of cosmic shepherding, of a creator whose attention encompassed not just Earth, but galaxies beyond counting. Following the glowing markers deeper along the trench wall, Marcus finally found what the alien had sent him to retrieve, a formation of crystalline growth unlike anything in his experience, pulsing with gentle inner light that seemed to beat in rhythm with his own heart. The substance grew from cracks in the ancient stone like frozen fire, each shard perfect and multifaceted, refracting his flashlight beam into rainbow cascades that danced across the surrounding darkness. He reached out with reverent slowness, his thick gloves suddenly feeling sacrilegious for this task. And as his fingers closed around the first crystal, warmth flooded up his arm despite the frigid water, accompanied by a sound he felt rather than heard, a chord of music that resonated in his bones and soul simultaneously. This was not merely mineral or element, but something that existed on the threshold between matter and spirit, a physical manifestation of divine intention crystallized through eons of patient growth in secret darkness. Marcus carefully harvested several pieces, placing them in the reinforced pouch at his belt, and with each crystal collected, he felt the alien's presence growing stronger in his mind, as if the very substance he gathered was creating a bridge between them, strengthening their impossible connection. As he began his ascent, rising slowly through the crushing dark toward the distant promise of dawn, Marcus understood with complete clarity that his life had been preparation for this single act of faith, that every lonely year, every abandonment and disappointment had been refining him into a vessel capable of receiving this cosmic trust without shattering under the weight of its significance. Breaking the surface felt like birth, Marcus gasping and sputtering as dawn light assaulted eyes adjusted to absolute darkness, the world above suddenly too bright, too loud, too immediate after the cathedral silence of the deep. He clung to the side of his boat for long moments, simply breathing, feeling his body remember what it meant to exist in air rather than water, while the precious cargo at his belt pulsed with warmth that penetrated wet suit and flesh to touch something deeper, more essential. The sky had transformed during his descent, night surrendering to bands of coral and gold that stretched across the horizon like a promise being slowly unveiled. And Marcus watched this daily miracle with new eyes, seeing in the gradual illumination a reflection of what was happening in his own soul. As he hauled himself over the gunwale, muscles screaming from exertion and cold, he felt simultaneously more exhausted than ever before and more vitally alive, as if the dive had burned away everything extraneous to his truest self, leaving only essence refined by pressure and darkness. The crystals in his pouch sang their silent song, and he found himself answering in wordless harmonies that rose from his chest unbidden, a melody he had never learned but somehow always known, written into the fabric of his being by the same hand that scattered stars across the void. The return journey passed in a state that was neither fully awake nor dreaming, Marcus rowing on autopilot while his mind remained partially submerged in the visions the symbols had awakened, seeing double, the familiar coastline approaching, and simultaneously the same shore as it had existed millennia ago, when those radiant beings had walked its sands. He understood now that Earth was no accident, no random collision of matter and chance, but a carefully tended garden planted with purpose, seeded with potential that spanned dimensions beyond human comprehension, and that every living thing from the smallest plankton to the greatest whale was part of an intricate design woven through with divine intention. The alien in his cabin was not an invader, but a refugee seeking sanctuary in a place prepared for exactly such moments. And he himself was not a random rescuer, but someone positioned by providence, his entire life a slow navigation toward this convergence of need and capacity. Tears streamed freely down his salt-crusted face as the full weight of this realization settled into his bones. He mattered, his existence had meaning woven into the cosmic tapestry, and the loneliness that had defined his years was revealed as preparation rather than punishment, solitude that had carved out space within him for mysteries too vast to share with those still sleeping through their lives. God had not abandoned him to isolation, but had been carefully, lovingly shaping him into an instrument, capable of holding sacred truths without breaking, and the gratitude that flooded through him was so intense it bordered on physical pain. Pulling his boat onto the beach, Marcus stumbled toward his cabin with the crystals clutched against his chest, their light now visible even through the sealed pouch, pulsing brighter as he approached the door, as if recognizing the proximity of the one who desperately needed their healing properties. He found the alien in worse condition than when he had left, its luminescence dimmed to barely perceptible flickers, the breathing shallow and irregular, and panic surged through his exhaustion as he rushed to its side, fumbling with frozen fingers to open the pouch and extract the precious cargo. The moment the first crystal touched the alien's translucent skin, reaction was instantaneous. Light blazed through the cabin with such intensity that Marcus had to shield his eyes, accompanied by a sound like wind chimes, composed of starlight, pure and piercing and unutterably beautiful. He watched in awe as the alien's body absorbed the crystalline substance, not consuming it physically but drawing its essence inward, color and vitality returning in visible waves that spread from the point of contact outward until the being was once again radiant with life, its eyes opening to fix Marcus with a gaze that held galaxies of gratitude and something deeper, something that looked remarkably like love. In that moment of meeting, human and alien, creators' children, both despite their radically different origins, Marcus felt barriers dissolve between species and worlds, recognizing in those ancient eyes the same divine spark that animated his own soul, the same breath of God that had hovered over primordial waters, speaking existence into being. The alien reached out with one delicate two-jointed hand and placed it directly over Marcus's heart, and suddenly he was no longer in his cabin, but standing in a space between spaces, surrounded by what he could only describe as the presence of God, made somehow perceptible to mortal senses. He saw Jesus there in the vastness, not as distant theological concept, but as living bridge between infinite and finite. The Word made flesh expanded to cosmic scale. Christ, who had walked dusty Palestinian roads, revealed as the same Logos through whom all things in all worlds were made, and through whom all scattered children, whether born of earth or distant stars, would ultimately find their way home. The alien showed him this not through words, but through direct knowing, consciousness touching consciousness, and Marcus understood that the message carried across light years at such desperate cost was simply this, that love was the fundamental force holding reality together, that every atom spun in orbits of divine affection, and that humanity's purpose, Earth's sacred calling, was to be beacons of that love, lighthouse keepers for lost travelers seeking harbor in an often dark and dangerous universe. When the vision released him, and he found himself once again in his simple cabin, dawn light streaming through salt-stained windows, illuminating his guest now restored to health, Marcus discovered he was weeping again. But these were tears of joy so profound they felt like prayer made liquid, gratitude too large for any other expression. The alien's hand remained pressed against his chest, and Marcus felt something shift in the space between heartbeats, reality becoming permeable, as though the walls of his cabin were suddenly constructed of mist rather than weathered wood. And through this thinning veil, other times began to bleed into the present moment. He saw his beach as it had been thousands of years before any human structure marked its shores, when beings of light descended from craft that defied earthly physics to walk among primitive peoples who fell to their knees in wonder and terror, recognizing divinity's ambassadors, though lacking language to name what they witnessed. These visitors came not as conquerors, but as gardeners, tending young growth, whispering into the consciousness of early humanity seeds of knowledge that would germinate across generations, agriculture, astronomy, architecture, arts that elevated survival into civilization. Marcus watched as they taught the ancients to read the stars not merely for navigation, but as a cosmic text written by the same hand that authored every human soul, showing how patterns in the heavens reflected patterns in the heart, macrocosm and microcosm, dancing together in harmonies composed before time began. The visions carried emotional weight that struck him like physical force. Each scene not merely observed but experienced from within, feeling the awe of those ancient witnesses as they realized they were not alone in creation, that the God they had sensed in thunder and earthquake and the mystery of birth was far vaster than their small world, his love extending through dimensions beyond their ability to measure. The images shifted, moving forward through history, and Marcus saw civilizations rise to heights of understanding that surpassed anything in modern textbooks, societies that had learned to blend spiritual wisdom with technological advancement, creating cultures where science and faith were not adversaries, but lovers engaged in perpetual discovery of truth's many facets. He witnessed great libraries filled with records of cosmic contact, star charts marking trade routes between worlds, temples designed to resonate with frequencies that opened consciousness to transcendent realms where God's presence could be directly experienced rather than merely believed. These were the legendary lost civilizations whispered about in myths: Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, not fantasies but realities. Human societies that had achieved what his own age was only beginning to stumble toward. The recognition that physical reality was merely the surface of an infinitely deeper mystery. But he saw too their fall, catastrophe both natural and self-inflicted, pride that led to misuse of knowledge, factions that chose power over love until the earth herself shook and waters rose to wipe the slate clean, preserving only fragments of wisdom hidden in symbols and stories that descendants would struggle to decode. Marcus felt the aliens' grief at these losses flowing through their connection, mourning not the buildings and technologies, but the souls who had turned from their sacred purpose, who had forgotten they were meant to be guardians, and become instead tyrants over the very creation they were called to protect and cherish. "Why show me this?" Marcus whispered aloud, his voice rough with emotion, the question directed both at the being beside him and at the God he felt hovering behind every revelation, like sunlight behind clouds, present though not yet fully visible. The alien's response came not in words, but in cascading understanding, consciousness. Speaking directly to consciousness, and Marcus knew with sudden clarity that humanity was approaching another threshold, a moment of collective choice that would determine whether the species awakened to its cosmic inheritance or descended into another cycle of forgetting and catastrophe. The visitors had never stopped coming, never abandoned Earth despite humanity's stumbling journey through violence and ignorance. Because God's love did not operate on conditional terms, he remained faithful even when his children wandered, and these otherworldly messengers were extensions of that divine persistence, angels wearing unfamiliar forms, but carrying the same essential message proclaimed by prophets and mystics across all ages. Marcus saw that his own era stood balanced on a knife's edge between transcendence and tragedy, technology advancing faster than wisdom, power accumulating in hands that grasped without understanding, the planet groaning under the weight of exploitation by those who had forgotten they were stewards rather than owners. Yet threaded through this darkness were lights beginning to kindle, individuals awakening to their true nature, remembering at soul level what their ancestors once knew. And he understood with humbling certainty that he was meant to be one of these lights, a keeper of flame in gathering dusk. The final vision pierced him with its intimacy and intensity, showing him the universe as God saw it, not as a cold, mechanical system, but as a living body, every star a cell in the corpus of creation, every world a nerve ending through which the divine experienced the joy and sorrow of existence made manifest. He saw Earth as a jewel of particular preciousness, a rare world where conditions aligned perfectly for life. The thrum of helicopters tore through the pre-dawn stillness, 3 days after Marcus retrieved the crystalline substance from the forbidden depths, their mechanical heartbeat so different from the ocean's rhythm that had governed his entire life. and he knew without needing confirmation that they were searching for what he harbored in his cabin. He stood at the salt-stained window, watching black vehicles materialize on the coastal road like insects drawn to carrion, their windows tinted against curiosity, their presence radiating authority that expected obedience without question or explanation. The alien lay in the corner, wrapped in fishing nets that now seemed pitifully inadequate protection, its luminescence dimmed but still pulsing with that light Marcus had come to recognize as the visible signature of something holy moving through flesh, and he felt a fierce protective instinct rise in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. This was no longer simply about sheltering a stranger, but about defending something sacred from forces that would dissect mystery rather than kneel before it, that would weaponize wonder rather than let it transform the human heart as God intended. His hands trembled as he watched a figure emerge from the lead vehicle, but the fear coursing through his veins carried a strange exhilaration, the sensation of a man who had lived small, suddenly called to stand large, to become more than the sum of his lonely routines and unexamined days. The alien's voice entered his mind with unusual urgency, no longer showing visions, but speaking in the wordless language they had developed through days of communion, warning him that those approaching carried technology, designed to detect what conventional science deemed impossible, instruments calibrated to hunt the very frequencies that marked divine intersection with material reality. Marcus was reaching for the door, prepared to surrender himself if it meant buying time, when a sharp knock came not from the front, but from the beachside entrance. 3 precise raps that somehow felt different from the aggressive authority gathering on the road above. He turned to find a woman standing in the grey pre-dawn light, her silhouette framed by the slowly brightening horizon. And though he had never seen her before, there was something in her stance that spoke of deep familiarity with situations precisely like this, a calm competence that came not from training, but from purpose that had been tested and refined through trials Marcus could only imagine. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through dark hair, pulled back severely, dressed in clothing that managed to be simultaneously practical and elegant, but it was her eyes that arrested him. Brown depths that held the same quality of ancient knowing he had seen reflected in the alien's strange gaze, as though she too had looked through time's veil and returned, changed. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried an accent he could not place, musicality that suggested languages learned across many borders. "I know you are frightened and confused, but you must listen carefully because we have only moments before they breach your door, and what happens in those moments will determine not just your fate, but the fate of everyone you are being called to help awaken." He should have demanded explanations, should have questioned how she knew his name or why he should trust. This stranger over the official forces gathering with their badges and legal authority, but something in his recently expanded consciousness recognized her as an ally, a fellow traveler on paths that wound through territories unmarked on any conventional map. The alien stirred in its corner, and Marcus saw its light brighten fractionally, a response that seemed to confirm what his intuition already suggested. This woman was part of the larger pattern being revealed, another thread in the tapestry that God was weaving from what had seemed like random chaos and accident. "My name is Sophia," she continued, stepping fully into the cabin now with movements that suggested both urgency and remarkable composure, her attention dividing between Marcus, the alien, and the approaching sounds of boots on wooden stairs outside. "And I represent a group that has existed for longer than any government currently surrounding us. Men and women scattered across every nation and culture who have been tasked with protecting Earth from those who would exploit rather than honor the sacred trust we have been given as guardians of this rare world." She moved to the alien's side, kneeling with a reverence that told Marcus she understood exactly what lay before her. and he watched as she placed her palm against the being's chest in the same gesture it had used on him, a ritual of recognition, passing between them that needed no translation because it operated in the universal language of souls, acknowledging shared purpose. "We have been watching for signs," Sophia said, her voice softening with emotion that made her seem suddenly vulnerable, despite her evident strength, waiting for the moment when the messengers would come again, as they have throughout history whenever humanity approaches a threshold. And 3 nights ago, our instruments registered the crash that brought your friend here. The same night I woke from dreams so vivid I could taste starlight and hear God's voice speaking through the void, telling me to come to this shore, to find the fisherman who would be called, to carry light into gathering darkness. Marcus felt tears on his face, though he could not remember beginning to cry, his entire understanding of reality continuing its profound reorganization, expanding to accommodate truths that would have seemed like madness just days ago, but now felt more real than anything he had previously accepted as solid and certain. The helicopter noise intensified overhead, downdraft making the cabin walls shudder, and Sophia's expression hardened with decision as she turned to face him fully, her next words carrying the weight of invitation into a larger story than any he had imagined for his small existence. "They will take the alien if we stay," she told him, with brutal honesty that he appreciated more than false comfort, her hand moving to grip his shoulder with surprising strength. "Dissect and study and ultimately destroy what they cannot control or understand, because fear makes humans cruel, and the powerful fear nothing more than mystery that refuses to submit to their authority or fit into their narrow definitions of possible and permissible." Outside, voices shouted commands in tones that brooked no resistance, the sound of equipment being positioned, preparations for breach and seizure that would come within heartbeats unless Marcus chose action over paralysis, courage over the safety of compliance that had governed most of his anonymous years. "But if you trust me," Sophia continued, her eyes searching his face for something she seemed to find, because her expression shifted toward hope, tempered with sorrow for what trust would cost him. "If you believe that what has happened here is not accident but appointment, that God has placed you at this intersection of cosmic history for purposes that will require everything you are and everything you might become, then we can take your friend to sanctuary, where the healing can complete, and the message he carries can be properly received and transmitted to those ready to awaken to their true inheritance as children of a Father whose kingdom extends far beyond one small planet spinning in an ordinary spiral arm of an unremarkable galaxy." The door shuddered under sudden impact, splinters appearing in wood that had withstood decades of storms, and Marcus felt time compressed to a single point of choice, the entire trajectory of his remaining existence balanced on what he decided in this fragment of eternity, whether he would retreat into the comfortable prison of conventional reality or step forward into the terrifying freedom of purpose that aligned his small life with the vast intentions of the divine, whose love had pursued humanity across eons and light years, never abandoning even when abandoned, always calling his scattered children home to remembrance of who they truly were and what they were created to become. Marcus heard his own voice say, "I trust you," even as the front door exploded inward with a crack that sounded like the breaking of an old world to make space for something new. And in that moment of declaration, Sophia moved with practiced precision, producing from her coat a device that looked like no technology he recognized, crystalline and organic simultaneously, which she pressed against the cabin's rear wall, causing it to shimmer and dissolve into an opening that revealed not the beach beyond, but a tunnel suffused with soft blue light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She gathered the alien with surprising strength for her frame, cradling the being like a mother might hold an injured child, and Marcus found himself following without hesitation into passage that sealed behind them, with a sound like water finding its level, muffling the shouts of the men who had invaded his former sanctuary, now reduced to empty shell that no longer mattered, because everything that gave it meaning was moving forward into mystery. The tunnel extended farther than the geography of the coastline should have allowed, descending at an angle that suggested they traveled not just through space, but through layers of reality that coexisted without most humans ever suspecting their presence, and Marcus felt his expanded consciousness straining to comprehend infrastructure that predated modern civilization, perhaps predated what historians called civilization entirely. "We walk in the old ways," Sophia said softly, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Paths that were ancient when Rome was young, maintained by those who remembered when the membrane between heaven and earth was thinner, and God walked openly among his children, teaching them truths that later generations would forget or bury beneath doctrines that served power rather than liberation." Her words resonated with something deep in Marcus's awakening memory, fragments of the past life visions the alien had begun unlocking in him, and he understood with sudden clarity that this was not his first journey through hidden ways, that his soul carried scars and glories from previous stands against forces that sought to contain the divine within manageable boundaries that denied its infinite nature. They emerged after what might have been minutes or hours. Time felt negotiable in the tunnel's strange atmosphere. Into a cavern so vast, Marcus could not see its ceiling, illuminated by formations of the same crystalline substance he had retrieved from the ocean depths, which grew from walls and floor in configurations that suggested not random geology, but intentional architecture aligned with purposes that transcended mere shelter. The space hummed with energy that made his teeth ache and his heart race, a frequency that felt simultaneously alien and intimately familiar, as though every cell in his body recognized this vibration as the fundamental tone from which physical reality was sung into existence by the word that John's Gospel proclaimed was with God, and was God from the beginning, before light separated from darkness, and dry land rose from formless waters. Sophia laid the alien gently on a platform of smooth stone at the cavern's center, where light concentrated most intensely, and Marcus watched as the being's luminescence began responding to the environment, brightening and pulsing in rhythms that matched the crystal's glow, a dialogue between substances that shared essential nature despite their different origins. "This is one of 7 sanctuaries scattered across the continents," Sophia explained, her face transformed by the ambient light into something both younger and more ancient, maintained by the group I serve, which has carried many names through the centuries, but answers ultimately only to the authority that established the stars in their courses, and knows every sparrow that falls, and numbers every hair on every head of every human who has ever drawn breath on this planet, that God loves with a particularity that would shatter our minds if we truly understood its depth. She turned to face Marcus fully now, and in her eyes he saw reflected the weight of knowledge that had sustained her through what must have been years of living double, appearing ordinary while serving extraordinary purpose. And he felt both honored and terrified to be invited into that same terrible privilege. "The alien you rescued is called Azrael in our tradition," Sophia continued, moving closer to Marcus with deliberate slowness, as though approaching a frightened animal she did not wish to startle. "Though that is translation rather than accurate rendering of a name that exists in frequencies human vocal cords cannot produce, and he is one of many messengers who travel between worlds that have accepted their place in the cosmic body that Paul only glimpsed when he wrote of principalities and powers, thrones and dominions. the vast ecology of conscious beings that God has created to populate his house of many mansions that Christ spoke of before his crucifixion and resurrection, opened pathways that had been sealed since humanity's ancient choice to grasp at knowledge, before we were mature enough to hold it without destroying ourselves and others. Her words tumbled over Marcus like waves he had spent his life navigating, each sentence requiring him to adjust his balance, to find new equilibrium in understanding that expanded faster than comfort. Aloud, but beneath the disorientation, he felt something like recognition, as though she was not teaching him new information so much as reminding him of truth his soul had always carried, but his conscious mind had been conditioned to dismiss as fantasy or metaphor rather than literal description of how reality actually functioned. These messengers come when humanity approaches thresholds, Sophia said, her voice dropping to near whisper, though they were alone, except for Azrael's unconscious form and the living presence of the crystals pulsing around them. Moments when we might ascend to fuller participation in the cosmic family, or descend into isolation that calcifies into extinction. And they do not come to save us, because salvation is not something done to humanity, but something we must choose for ourselves, must activate through decisions that align our will with the divine will that seeks only our flourishing and the flourishing of all life everywhere, across the billion galaxies that spin in darkness, shot through with light that will not be overcome, no matter how deep the shadow grows or how long the night extends. Marcus felt his knees weaken, not with fear, but with the overwhelming recognition that his small life had been gathered into purposes so vast, that pride and self-importance became impossible, that whatever role he was being asked to play was significant not because he was special, but because every soul was special, every human a unique expression of the infinite creativity that God deployed in making a universe where free will could dance with divine intention, and somehow both remain true without cancelling the other. The galactic reckoning Azrael brings warning of is not judgment, in the sense religious tradition often imagines, Sophia said, kneeling now beside the platform where the alien rested, gesturing for Marcus to join her in posture that felt like prayer, though no words were spoken aloud, but rather a moment of cosmic maturation, when species must demonstrate they have evolved beyond adolescent grasping and violence into wisdom that can handle technologies and powers that could either heal worlds or shatter them, and Earth stands now at that threshold, with humanity's choices in coming years, determining whether we join the greater community as contributing members or remain quarantined until we grow up or destroy ourselves, whichever comes first. She reached for Marcus's hand with her left while placing her right on Azrael's chest, creating a circuit through which energy began flowing that Marcus felt as warmth that started in his palm and spread through his entire body, not burning, but illuminating. As though every cell was waking from sleep it had not known it suffered, remembering purposes. Encoded in his DNA by the same intelligence that scattered stars like seeds and set planets in their orbits, and breathed into clay the spirit that made it living soul, capable of knowing and being known by its creator. We protect Earth by awakening humans to their true nature, Sophia continued, her voice now layered with harmonics that suggested she was no longer speaking only from her own understanding, but channeling something larger that used her as instrument, calling forth the memory that you are not accidents of chemistry, but intentional creations of a father who sacrificed his son to prove that death itself could not separate his children from his love, and that sacrifice opened pathways not just for human redemption, but for cosmic reconciliation, bringing together all things in heaven and earth, as Ephesians prophesied, and messengers like Azrael are part of that great gathering, that harvest of consciousness that has been ripening since the resurrection, demonstrated that matter and spirit need not oppose but can interpenetrate in ways that transform both. Marcus wept openly now. All pretense of masculine stoicism dissolved in the presence of truth too beautiful and terrible to defend against, and he understood that the loneliness that had defined his existence had never been personal failure, but rather the ache of a soul that knew itself incomplete. Because it was incomplete, that humanity was incomplete, that all creation groaned in labor pains, waiting for the children of God to be revealed in their full glory, as Paul had written with prophetic precision nearly 2,000 years before this moment, in a cavern beneath the sea, where past and future collapsed into an eternal present saturated with holy purpose. Azrael stirred beneath their joined hands at midnight under the full moon that poured silver light through an opening in the cavern ceiling Marcus had not noticed before. And Sophia whispered that the time had come for the ritual that would either awaken what lay dormant in his soul or prove him unprepared for the burden of remembering lives his conscious mind had never lived, but his spirit had never forgotten. They carried the alien between them back through tunnels that twisted differently than before, as though the paths rearranged themselves according to need rather than fixed geography, emerging finally onto a hidden stretch of beach where black sand met water, that glowed with bioluminescence, each wave cresting in cascades of blue-green fire that seemed less natural phenomenon than conscious response to their presence and purpose. The ocean stretched before them, vast and breathing, its rhythm matching the pulse Marcus felt in his chest and temples, and he understood with sudden clarity that this was not coincidence, but connection, that the waters covering most of Earth's surface were not mere chemistry but living memory, holding in solution every molecule that had passed through every creature since life first crawled from tide pools into sunlight and air. Sophia began humming a melody that had no cultural origin Marcus could identify yet, felt older than any music he had ever heard. Notes that seemed to rise from the sand itself and call down response from stars that burned with light that had begun its journey toward Earth before his grandfather's grandfather was born, traversing incomprehensible distances to arrive exactly here, exactly now, as though all of cosmic history had been calibrated to produce this moment on this beach with these three beings standing at the threshold of transformation. Azrael opened eyes that had been closed since Marcus first pulled him from the fishing nets, and in their depths Marcus saw reflected not his own face but faces plural, a succession of men and women who shared his essential features but wore different skin tones and clothing from different eras, warriors and healers and teachers and builders, whose lives had ended in ways both peaceful and violent, but who all carried the same core of light that he now recognized burning in his own chest like a coal that had never been extinguished through all the deaths and rebirths. His soul had traversed. The alien raised trembling hands and placed them on either side of Marcus's head with touch that felt like being held by water, cool and yielding, yet somehow solid enough to support weight. And Marcus gasped as images flooded his awareness with force that would have knocked him down if Sophia had not moved behind him, bracing his body with her own, while whispering prayers in languages that shifted and changed, ancient Greek flowing into Aramaic, flowing into something that predated alphabets entirely, pure sound that shaped reality rather than merely describing it. He saw himself standing on this same beach when it was not beach but swampland, where creatures that would become human huddled around fires and looked up at stars with newly awakened capacity for wonder. And he knew that even then he had been called, set apart not as superior but as servant, tasked with remembering connection when others forgot, with pointing back toward the source when humanity wandered into wilderness of its own making. He saw himself in robes, standing before temples that history had forgotten, teaching small groups of disciples about the fundamental unity that contained all diversity, about the love that had spoken everything into existence and sustained it each moment through attention that never wavered or withdrew. And he saw how that teaching had been suppressed and distorted by those who feared what they could not control, who preferred religion that made God small and manageable rather than acknowledge the wild infinity that could never be contained in doctrine or institution. The visions accelerated until they blurred into stream of light and color and emotion that transcended individual lifetime. And Marcus felt his identity dissolving not into nothing, but into everything, his small self revealed as temporary formation of eternal substance that could take infinite shapes without ever losing essential nature. And in that dissolution he heard voice that was not voice speaking words, that were not words saying, "You are my beloved child in whom I am well pleased. You have always been mine and will always be mine. Nothing you have done or left undone changes the love I hold for you. And this love is not earned, but given freely, as I give breath and heartbeat. And your purpose is simply to remember this truth and help others remember, to be transparent to the light that wants, to pour through every human who will cease grasping long enough to receive what has always been offered without condition or limit." Marcus sobbed with relief, and grief intermingled. Relief that the burden of self-creation could be laid down because he was already created perfectly for purposes he had spent lifetimes fulfilling, even when he did not consciously know what he was doing, and grief for all the years he had felt separate and alone, when in truth he had never been alone, even for a single breath. That the very loneliness he had suffered was itself evidence of connection, because you cannot ache for union unless you know at some level that union is your true home. Azrael's hands grew warmer against his temples, and the alien's luminescence intensified until Marcus had to close his eyes against brightness that seemed to shine not from outside, but from inside his own skull, as though his brain was being rewired, neural pathways rearranged to accommodate consciousness that had always been available, but which his ordinary state could not access without assistance from those who had evolved beyond limitations that humanity still struggled against. When the light finally faded and Azrael's hands withdrew and Marcus opened his eyes again, the beach looked simultaneously exactly the same and completely transformed, as though he was seeing it for the first time, despite having walked this coast for decades. Every grain of sand now visible as individual miracle, every shell fragment a story of life lived and concluded, every wave a verse in the endless poem that ocean sang in praise of the God who had gathered waters into seas and called the result good in those first days when speaking and creating were the same act. Sophia steadied him as his legs remembered how to bear weight, and she smiled with expression that held both joy and sadness. Joy that he had survived the awakening that some minds could not endure. Sadness, perhaps, that he would now carry weight of knowledge that could never be unlearned or ignored, that would require him to live differently than he had before, to make choices most humans never had to consciously make because they never became aware that choices existed beyond the narrow options their culture presented as totality of possibility. Azrael swayed between them like tree in wind, and Marcus understood that the ritual had cost the alien considerably, that transferring dormant memory into active consciousness required energy that Azrael could barely spare in his weakened state, and he felt gratitude beyond words for sacrifice made on his behalf by being he had known for less than 3 days, but who felt closer now than family, than friends, than any connection his previous life had offered. The full moon hung above them, perfect and complete, its reflected light painting silver path across dark water from horizon to shore, and Marcus heard himself say aloud without planning to speak, "I am ready now for whatever comes. I understand that I am part of something vast and good, and I will serve as I have always served, even when I forgot I was serving." And his words seemed to please both Sophia and Azrael, though neither responded verbally because none was needed, because they all three knew that forces closing in would arrive soon, and decisions would have to be made that would determine not just their individual fates, but potentially the trajectory of humanity's relationship with the cosmos that surrounded and sustained Earth, like parent cradling precious child who was finally slowly beginning to wake and recognize where it truly lived. The drones arrived, with the first pale hints of dawn bleeding into the eastern sky, their mechanical hum a discordant note against the eternal rhythm of waves that had been washing this shore since before humanity learned to name the things it feared. Marcus heard them before he saw them, tiny, dark shapes moving against stars that were fading as light crept across the world, and he felt Sophia's hand tighten on his arm in warning, while Azrael turned his luminous face upward with expression that might have been resignation or might have been recognition, that all journeys eventually reach their destination, regardless of whether travelers feel prepared for arrival. The alien's glow had diminished since the ritual, his form seeming more translucent than before, as though the act of awakening Marcus's dormant memories had cost him some essential substance that could not be easily replenished. And Marcus understood with sudden terrible clarity that Azrael was dying, that the crystalline element retrieved from the ocean trench had bought time but not cure, had allowed the alien to complete his mission, but would not sustain him long enough to witness what grew from seeds he had planted in human soil. Black vehicles appeared on the cliff road above, the beach moving with purposeful speed that suggested their occupants knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find when they arrived, and Sophia pulled both Marcus and Azrael toward the cave entrance they had emerged from hours earlier. But the alien resisted, planting his feet in the black sand with surprising strength for one so weakened, shaking his head slowly while his eyes held knowledge that transcended the immediate danger closing in around them from land and sky. Azrael reached out and took Marcus's hand in his own, and the touch sent cascading warmth through Marcus's body that felt like sunlight on skin after long winter, like reunion with beloved friend after years of separation. And he heard without hearing the alien's voice speaking directly into the center of his being, where words dissolved into pure meaning. "I cannot leave," Azrael communicated in images and emotions that Marcus's newly awakened consciousness translated into language his human mind could process, "not because I am trapped, but because my purpose was never to return to the stars, but to pour what I carry into soil that will nurture it into forms my people cannot take, because we evolved past certain necessary limitations, past the beautiful vulnerability that makes your species capable of housing divine love in ways that more advanced beings paradoxically cannot." Marcus wanted to protest, to insist they could still escape, could hide deeper in the cave system, or steal one of the vehicles, or swim out past the breakers to where Sophia claimed their organization kept boats, ready for exactly this kind of emergency. But Azrael's eyes held such peace that argument died before reaching Marcus's lips, because he recognized in that alien gaze the same fundamental acceptance he had felt during the ritual, when his small self dissolved into larger self, and he understood that death was not ending, but transition, not loss, but transformation into different mode of existence, that the source of all being held with the same tender attention it gave to every living thing. The drones circled lower now, their cameras and sensors no doubt recording everything, transmitting data to agencies whose acronyms Marcus did not know but whose fear of what they could not control he understood intimately, because it was the same fear that had kept him alone in his cabin for years, afraid to connect deeply with others. Because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant possible pain. "You must understand," Azrael continued as Sophia stood watching with tears streaming down her face that caught the growing dawn light, "that I am not separate from what you call God, but an expression of the same love that created your world and mine, that spoke Jesus into flesh to show humanity what divine life looks like when lived through human limitation. And my people learned long ago that we are all fingers on the same hand, distinct but never separate. And our mission across galaxies is simply to remind younger civilizations of this truth before they destroy themselves through forgetting. The alien's form began to glow more intensely despite his obvious weakness, light increasing as his physical coherence decreased, and Marcus realized with awe and horror that Azrael was preparing to do something irrevocable, something that would save Marcus and Sophia from the forces descending upon them, but would cost the alien everything he had left. "I transfer to you my mission and my remaining energy," Azrael said, as his hands moved to press against Marcus's chest directly over his heart. "Not as burden, but as gift, because you have already been doing this work across lifetimes, and now you will do it with full awareness, teaching others to see the signs written in water and stars, helping them remember they are beloved children of the One who breathed galaxies into existence and calls each creature by name that only that creature's soul recognizes." Marcus felt something like lightning surge through his body as Azrael's essence began flowing into him, energy that carried not just power but knowledge, memories of worlds Marcus had never visited and species he had never imagined. But more than information, it carried love, the fundamental reality that held all things in existence, the truth that creation was not an event in the distant past, but an ongoing act of divine attention that never wavered. And he understood finally that this was what Jesus had tried to teach, what all true prophets had pointed toward, that the kingdom of heaven was not a place to reach after death, but a recognition available in every moment to those who stopped grasping and simply received what was already being given without measure or condition. Azrael's physical form dissolved into pure radiance that shot upward like reverse lightning, a column of light that pierced through the morning sky and scattered the drones with electromagnetic pulse that sent them spinning into the ocean, while the black vehicles on the cliff road stopped abruptly as their electronics failed and their occupants stumbled out, shielding their eyes against brightness that should not have been possible from any terrestrial source. Marcus stood transfixed as the light ascended, growing smaller but not dimmer, maintaining its luminous intensity even as distance increased until it became indistinguishable from the stars it rejoined. And he felt simultaneously emptied and filled. Grief for the alien who had sacrificed his chance to return home, mingled with gratitude for the gift that now burned in his chest like coal, that would never be extinguished, that would sustain him through whatever came next. Sophia embraced him as he wept, his tears falling onto black sand that seemed to absorb them like benediction. And she whispered that Azrael had not died but transformed, had become part of Marcus just as Marcus was part of the larger body that included all conscious beings across all worlds, and that the alien's love would continue working through him to awaken others who carried the same dormant memory of humanity's cosmic purpose as guardians and teachers, as those who would help Earth take its place among the community of worlds that served the source of all light and life and love. The weeks that followed Azrael's ascension moved with the strange fluidity of dreams that refused to release their hold even after waking. Time seeming both accelerated and suspended as Marcus returned to his small cabin by the sea that looked exactly as he had left it, yet felt transformed by the consciousness he now brought to every moment within its weathered walls. He pulled his nets at dawn as he always had, feeling the rough rope against palms that bore the same calluses they had carried for years. But now each fish that emerged silver and gasping from the dark water seemed to pulse with the same divine attention that maintained stars. In their courses, and he found himself whispering gratitude not just for the catch that would feed his body, but for the profound privilege of participating in the great circulation of life that flowed from source through infinite forms and back to source again in endless sacred rhythm. Sophia visited sometimes, appearing without warning at his dugga with bread and wine, and news of others around the world who were waking to their purpose, showing him photographs on her phone of people in distant cities who had begun seeing the signs, whose dormant memories were stirring as though Marcus's awakening had sent ripples through some invisible web, connecting all those who had agreed before. Birth to serve as guardians when the time came for humanity's consciousness to expand beyond the small, fearful stories that had contained it for so long. They would sit together at his rough wooden table, watching the ocean through windows that framed the eternal conversation between water and light, and she would tell him that the organizations who had sent those drones and black vehicles were still searching, but with less certainty now, their confidence shaken by phenomenon their instruments could not measure and their paradigms could not contain, while the secret network she belonged to grew stronger, preparing for the day when truth could be spoken openly, without triggering the violent fear that had suppressed it for generations. Marcus discovered that the gift Azrael had transferred into him manifested not as flashy supernatural abilities, but as deepened perception that allowed him to see what had always been present, but typically went unnoticed by minds too cluttered with anxiety and acquisition to perceive the luminous foundation underlying ordinary reality. Walking along the beach at sunset, he would notice patterns in the way waves broke against rocks, rhythms that seemed to carry information about weather systems forming far out at sea, but also about less tangible movements in the collective human spirit. Shifts in consciousness that preceded changes. In the material world, the way distant thunder announces approaching storms, the stars at night spoke to him not in words but in memories that were simultaneously his and not his. Recollections of other lives in other times when he had done this same work under different names, sometimes as fisherman like now, sometimes as monk or teacher or simple farmer whose crops fed bodies, while his presence fed something deeper in those who came seeking bread and found themselves mysteriously lightened of burdens they could not articulate. He began to understand what Azrael had meant about chosen humans being guardians, that this was not elitist selection by arbitrary deity, but recognition of those souls who had volunteered across multiple incarnations to maintain certain frequencies of love and awareness during ages of forgetting, serving as hidden anchors that prevented humanity from drifting so far into darkness that the way back to light became impossible to find. Most profound was the growing recognition that Jesus had been the fullest expression of what Marcus now carried in seed form, that Christ had demonstrated what human life looked like when lived in complete transparency to divine love, when the small separate self surrendered so thoroughly to the infinite self that miracles became natural expressions of the compassion that formed galaxies and numbered sparrows, and knew every person's secret name. The loneliness that had defined Marcus's existence for so many years dissolved not because he suddenly acquired many friends, but because he could no longer feel separate from the vast communion of beings, visible and invisible, who shared the same source and the same fundamental nature, despite their wildly different forms and levels of development. Pulling his nets in the grey light before sunrise, he would sense Azrael's presence not as ghost haunting the periphery of perception, but as intimate interior reality, the alien's consciousness having merged with his own in ways that transcended the boundaries his culture insisted were absolute and impermeable between self and other. He felt the presence of Jesus too, not as distant historical figure or theological abstraction, but as living love that breathed through his breath and looked through his eyes at creation that was always being spoken into existence by the Word that had become flesh, to show that flesh had always been Word, that matter and spirit were not opposites, but different densities of the same divine substance. Sometimes people would arrive at his cabin unannounced, drawn by instinct they could not explain, and he would give them fish and listen to their stories and watch recognition dawn in their faces as they encountered in his weathered fisherman's presence something that reminded them of who they truly were beneath the accumulated identities and wounds and fears that obscured their original blessing. He never spoke of Azrael or the ritual or the visions of Earth's cosmic purpose unless someone asked directly, and even then he shared only what he sensed they were ready to receive, trusting that each soul had its own timing and its own curriculum, designed by the same infinite intelligence that guided salmon home through thousands of miles of ocean to the exact stream where their lives began. Marcus understood finally that his simple life had not been escape or failure, but preparation, that the years of solitude had hollowed him out in ways that made him capable of holding what Azrael needed to pour into human vessel, and that his return to ordinary routine after such extraordinary encounter was not anticlimax, but the whole point, because awakening that could not be lived through daily tasks of fishing and cooking and mending nets was merely spiritual entertainment rather than transformation. The sacred purpose that replaced his loneliness was not dramatic mission requiring travel to distant places or speeches before crowds, but the quiet work of being fully present to each moment, allowing divine love to flow through him into whatever situation or person appeared before him, trusting that the same wisdom that positioned planets in their orbits knew exactly what was needed and would provide it through those who had learned to stop obstructing grace with agendas and expectations. He would stand at the ocean's edge in the evening, watching the sun descend into water that held both sunset and stars in its dark mirror, and he would feel the presence of countless others around the world doing similar work in their own contexts, all of them threads in a vast weaving whose pattern served purposes beyond what any single thread could comprehend, and he knew with certainty that exceeded mere belief that everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, that humanity was being guided with infinite patience toward recognition of its true nature and its cosmic family, and that the love that had sent Azrael across galaxies and had spoken Jesus into flesh would never abandon its beloved children, but would continue calling them home through every available means until the last lost sheep remembered the voice of the shepherd who had never stopped seeking those who wandered in darkness, waiting for the moment when they would finally be ready to turn toward light that had been pursuing them with relentless tenderness since before the foundation of the world. What signs are appearing in your own life that you might have been overlooking? Subscribe to continue this journey into the mysteries that connect us all to something far greater than we ever imagined.